Focus to Zimbabwe, the country is paying millions in compensation to white farmers whose land was forcibly seized 2 decades ago.
In the heart of southern Africa lies Zimbabwe, a nation once hailed as the breadbasket of the continent, but beneath the soil rich with promise is a legacy of turmoil, displacement, and the long painful journey toward justice. Today, 2 decades after a controversial land reform program turned the country upside down, Zimbabwe is paying a heavy price, millions in compensation to white farmers who lost everything during one of the most radical land redistributions in modern history. To understand Zimbabwe's present, we must go back to its past. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, after a long and bloody liberation struggle, it inherited a deeply unequal land ownership structure. Under British colonial rule and settler policies, the best and most fertile land had been taken by a small white minority. Roughly 4,000 white farmers owned nearly 70% of the country's arable land, while millions of black Zimbabweans were crowded into poor, dry, communal areas. Land had long been at the center of the liberation struggle. The promise of land was not just a political slogan, it was a matter of justice, dignity, and survival.
I'm sorry I've got a white skin, all right? But I know how to farm.
Thousands of white farmers whose properties were expropriated during the land invasions have waited for up to 16 years for compensation. John Worsley Warswick, who was evicted from his farm in 2004, led the Justice for Agriculture, an organization that helped farmers sue Zimbabwe in international courts.
I'm the legal rightful owner of this property until such time as I'm compensated.
By the year 2000, 2 decades after independence, the promise of land reform had largely gone unfulfilled. Political pressures were mounting. President Robert Mugabe, under growing domestic and international criticism, launched what would become the most dramatic and controversial policy of his long rule, a fast-track land reform program aimed at forcibly redistributing land from white farmers to landless black Zimbabweans. The move was sudden, it was radical, and it was, for many, chaotic and violent. Mugabe defended the program as a necessary correction of colonial injustice. "The land is ours," he famously declared. "We are taking it back." But the reality on the ground was more complex. The land was meant for the people, but who actually received it? Critics of the program argue that many of the beneficiaries were not the poor or landless, but political elites. Mugabe's allies, ministers, generals, judges, were awarded prime farmland. Some received multiple farms, and most of them had little to no agricultural experience. Meanwhile, thousands of skilled white farmers, along with their black farm workers, were dispossessed. The agricultural infrastructure that had sustained the economy collapsed almost overnight. Production of key crops like maize and tobacco plummeted. Zimbabwe, once an exporter of food, became dependent on imports and international aid. The consequences of the land reform were catastrophic for Zimbabwe's economy. Agriculture was the backbone of the country's GDP. With its collapse came a domino effect, rising unemployment, food insecurity, and a massive drop in export earnings. Inflation began to spiral. By 2008, Zimbabwe would experience one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in recorded history. Prices doubled every 24 hours. People carried wheelbarrows of currency to buy a loaf of bread. The Zimbabwean dollar was eventually abandoned altogether. The political unrest deepened. Western governments imposed sanctions, accusing the Mugabe regime of human rights abuses and undemocratic practices. Zimbabwe was effectively cut off from international financial markets. In 2017, after nearly 4 decades in power, Robert Mugabe was removed in a military-backed coup. His longtime ally and vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, took power with promises of reform. Mnangagwa declared a new dispensation. He promised to reopen Zimbabwe to the world, to respect property rights, and to rebuild the broken economy. One of his most significant moves, revisiting the land reform's legacy through compensation. In 2020, the Zimbabwean government signed a historic compensation agreement with displaced white farmers. The deal promised $3.5 billion in total, aimed not at returning land, but at compensating for improvements made to the land, buildings, irrigation systems, machinery, and infrastructure. This move was unprecedented. Mnangagwa framed it as a moral and economic imperative. "We cannot move forward without addressing the past," he said. "This is about closure and rebuilding trust." The agreement covered over 4,000 farmers, but it also raised critical questions. Where would the money come from? Zimbabwe's government, still saddled with billions in foreign debt, did not have the funds. In 2025, Zimbabwe made its first tangible step toward fulfilling the deal, an initial payout of $3 million to local white farmers. This covered 378 farms out of 740 approved in the first phase. It was a symbolic amount, just 1% of the $311 million allocated for the initial phase, but it sent a message. For many of the recipients, it was less about the money and more about recognition. Acknowledgement that what happened 2 decades ago was wrong, and that the state had an obligation to make amends. Zimbabwe's move comes at a time when neighboring South Africa is facing its own land reform debates. In 2018, then U.S. President Donald Trump accused South Africa of seizing white-owned farms, raising tensions, and threatening sanctions. Zimbabwe's compensation deal could be a blueprint or a cautionary tale for others. By compensating former landowners, the country is seeking to rebuild trust with Western investors and multilateral lenders. Analysts say that if Zimbabwe can show good faith and a willingness to right the past, it might reopen doors long closed. Earlier this year, the Zimbabwean government also began compensating foreign investors whose farms had been protected under bilateral treaties. This move is critical for restoring international credibility, but challenges remain. Many former farmers now live abroad, dispersed across Australia, the UK, and South Africa. Others have died, leaving families to seek justice on their behalf. Some remain skeptical, fearing the payouts will be delayed or derailed by political instability. Zimbabwe's land story is far from over. The land issue remains emotionally charged, a symbol of colonial injustice, racial inequality, and economic mismanagement. But the recent compensation efforts show a country trying to reconcile with its past without abandoning its sovereignty. President Mnangagwa insists that the land will not be returned, but that justice in some form must be served. For now, millions still struggle. Many resettled farmers lack access to credit, training, and markets. Reviving agriculture will require more than payouts. It will require reform, investment, and a genuine commitment to productivity. Zimbabwe's soil has long borne witness to the struggles of its people, from colonial conquest to liberation war, from reform to ruin. Today that soil carries the hope of renewal. With every dollar paid, every hectare tilled, and every step toward justice, Zimbabwe is edging closer to a future it has long deserved, but only time will tell if this new chapter brings healing or simply another wound to the land.
Shifting focus to Zimbabwe, the country is paying millions in compensation to white farmers whose land was forcibly seized 2 decades ago. Zimbabwe's government has announced an initial payout of $3 million to local white farmers who lost their land in the early 2000s. The farms were seized during a controversial land reform program between 2000 and 2001. Now, this is the first payment under a 2020 compensation deal between the state and the farmers. Under that agreement, Zimbabwe promised to pay $3.5 billion in total. The current payout covers 378 farms out of the 740 approved for compensation. Now, it accounts for just 1% of the $311 million allocated for the first phase. The government says that this marks a step toward honoring its obligations to compensate farmers affected by land seizures. In 2000, then President Robert Mugabe launched a radical land reform. Thousands of white farmers lost their land, which was redistributed to Black Zimbabweans. The move was meant to correct historic injustices. As at independence in 1980, most fertile land was owned by just 4,000 black farmers. But the land reforms were often violent and aggressive. Critics say that many farms went to Mugabe's political allies, while new landholders lacked the tools and training to farm effectively. In the aftermath, agricultural production collapsed and the economy crashed. Now, Zimbabwe's relations with the West also fell apart. President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who came to power after the 2017 coup, has been trying to repair ties with the West. Zimbabwe has been isolated from the global financial system for over 2 decades. Its economy is still burdened with massive foreign debt. Earlier this year, the government also began compensating foreign investors whose land was protected under bilateral treaties. The latest compensation move also comes as neighboring South Africa faces tensions with the US. President Donald Trump accuses South Africa of seizing white-owned farms and has used it to justify cutting aid and expelling diplomats. Analysts say that Zimbabwe's payouts could help to repair Western relations and avoid international scrutiny.